We ended the last episode with the car that runs, drives, and is nice and clean. Sounds pretty perfect, right? Well, not quite. The car is still almost 30 years old and needs a lot of work. It has fresh oil, but other than that, we pretty much just gave it a checkup. This time around, we'll start with this big pile of parts. We won't be installing everything in this episode, and this won't be all the parts we're going to need, but it's a pretty good start. Just to name a few, we've got wiper blades, lift supports, an air filter, plugs and wires, cap and rotor, sway bar end links, a transmission mount, a thermostat, a battery hold down, a fuel filter, a PCV valve, a transmission output shaft seal, and obviously exhaust parts, as well as hoses and caps and other general maintenance items for an older car. Clearly, we've got a lot to take care of. We'll jump right in and replace the hood supports so that we can start working without the broom handle. As we can see here, the hood supports aren't really doing anything except making the hood a little bit harder to open. It's a big, heavy hood, and I guess these little supports need to work pretty hard. So, to help us replace them, we'll use the broom handle one last time to hold open the hood. The hydraulic hood supports are mounted in a pretty typical way. The upper part of the hood support strut can be easily removed with a large flat blade screwdriver and a mallet. And make sure to be careful and not damage any parts. Wait, hang on. What clips are we showing? No, next one. So we can just remove the upper hood support easily with a flat blade screwdriver and a mallet. Once that clip has been removed partway from its groove, a few taps from the mallet will free the strut. These struts have to be pretty strong to support this hood, and as we can see just by pressing on it, it doesn't take too much force to compress it. The clip retaining the lower portion of the strut is very straightforward and can just be removed by hand. And with that out of the way, we can fully remove the strut from the vehicle. And of course, we'll remove the strut from the other side in the same way. It comes off much more easily now that we know what we're doing. Well, we know enough to be on YouTube anyway. It's actually easier to open and close the hood now than it was with the struts installed. But of course, we still need some way to prop it up, and it's not really practical to keep that broom handle around forever. And that's why we have this pair of new hood struts. The two new struts have the same part number and are from the same manufacturer, although they are a little bit different from each other. They were probably just made in different locations, and it really shouldn't be an issue. They have the same mounting clips and extended length as the old units, so these should be the correct replacements. And just for kicks, we'll compare how difficult it is to compress each of the struts. The old ones take a bit of force, but nothing too crazy. The new ones, I actually wasn't really able to compress them at all. They're pretty stiff. So now we'll go ahead and install the new struts onto the car. They didn't include new clips for the lower mounting points, so we'll reuse the old ones. To install the top side, we'll lift the hood up a little bit to position things just right and then pop it into place. It would have been a good idea to use a little bit of grease when installing these, but I guess it slipped my mind at the time. We'll leave the broom handle there for now, as it doesn't seem like the one strut is quite enough to hold the hood open. But we can very quickly remedy that by installing the driver's side hood strut, and then everything works like it should. The hood stays open by itself, and the struts are actually strong enough to open it pretty much all the way once it's unlatched. So it seems like we have the hood opening and closing very smoothly and everything working like it should. But what about the back hatch? The hatch pull-down mechanism is still kind of working, at least well enough to get the hatch open consistently. But the hatch is very heavy and these old struts aren't enough to hold it open. So one last time we'll get a helping hand from our old friend, the broomstick. The hatch struts are much longer and even stronger to support the weight of all that metal and glass. They also have electrical connectors to connect to the rear defrost. We'll go ahead and remove that connector as well as the little 8mm bolts holding in the strut. And with that bolt removed, we can simply slide the top of the strut off of the mount by lifting up on the hatch. We definitely have to be careful throughout this process not to drop the whole thing. With the top side disconnected, we can remove the electrical connector on the body side and the plastic trim cap, and I'm somehow not surprised that the bugs have been there too. Next, we'll use a Torx socket and a long ratchet to undo the bolt holding in the bottom of the strut. Just like the small bolt on the hatch side, this one is also held in with thread locker, so it takes quite a bit of force to remove. And once that bolt is out, we can remove the entire strut from the vehicle. And again, we'll compare the new and old struts and make sure they're about the same. The old strut is still fairly hard to compress, but I can compress it a bit. The new one, even by standing on it, won't move whatsoever. We'll slide the bolt out of the old strut and clean the threads up a bit, and then install it in the new one so that it's ready to go back in the car. The rubber boot for the body side of the defrost connector is cracked and torn. I'm not sure where to get a covering like that, so for now we'll just wrap the whole thing in electrical tape and hold it on with a zip tie. That'll at least make me feel a bit better about it. Then we'll apply some medium strength blue thread locker to the bolt. Once we unclog the nozzle. Once we unclog the nozzle. And once we do manage to get a drop of thread locker on the bolt, we'll reinstall the strut and make sure everything is where it needs to be. I'm sure a torque spec for this bolt is out there somewhere, but at the time of recording, I couldn't quite find it, so we'll just make it nice and tight. Then we'll pop the trim cap back into place and reconnect the wire. We'll apply a little bit of dielectric grease to this connection to help keep it from corroding. That spade connector also fit a little bit loosely on there, so we'll just bend the prongs a tiny bit to make sure everything stays together. Then, to get the other end of the strut slotted in, we'll lift up the hatch a bit and get it into place. Then we'll put a drop of blue Loctite on that bolt and get it threaded in. And once we reframe the camera, we will tighten that bolt too. Definitely do so carefully since it is a very small fastener. And then another glob of dielectric grease and we'll reconnect the window defroster. And then of course, we'll repeat the same process on the other side. Or, well, we'd love to if we could get that connector loose. But then once we eventually got it loose, we could remove the bolt and then disconnect the top of the strut. Then the car side of the assembly can be taken apart and the bolt loosened. And again, once we unthread the bolt, the strut can be removed. Then, with fresh thread locker on the bolt, we'll tighten the lower end of the strut into the car. And once that's back together and the connector is taped up just like on the other side, we'll slot the other end of the strut back into place on the hatch. Since the hatch is so heavy, it does require some amount of manhandling, but do be careful since it is a large piece of glass. Then we'll apply more thread locker, reinstall the hold-down bolt, and the connector. And once we remove the broomstick, we can see it's not needed anymore. The struts are very strong, definitely enough to hold open the hatch. So now we also have the hatch opening and closing easily. Now we can see how it's supposed to work. You undo that latch and then you can open the trunk with basically one finger, and the only thing you have to do is make sure it doesn't lift up too fast. Installing all these struts was definitely worth it in order to not have to lift these giant heavy panels every time I need to open them. But even though the broomstick isn't needed here anymore, we still appreciate its dutiful service. We'll lay him to rest for now, but maybe one day we'll need a hero like him again. The next things we're going to check out are the windshield wipers. First, we're just going to go ahead and replace the blades. They are old and the rubber is falling apart. These wiper arms use a pin type connector, which makes them very easy to remove. All we have to do is lift up this little tab and the old blade will come right off. If the cobwebs weren't an indicator that these were needing to be replaced, the rubber coming off definitely is. The new blades are shipped with this funny little plastic tensioning piece, so we'll go ahead and remove that and make sure the blade is the same length as the old one. Everything checks out, so we'll go ahead and snap them into place on the wiper arm. It feels secure and is making good contact with the windshield, so we'll go ahead and replace the other one. With that installed, we'll open up the hood and top off the windshield washer fluid. And with the tank filled up, we'll go ahead and close the hood and test the whole system. The wipers rise to life just as they should, although a bit slowly at first since they have been sitting for quite a while and the car's not running. The windshield washer pump and fluid system also appears to work correctly. The wipers maybe weren't an immediately needed system, but it's definitely good to know that they work and to have that out of the way. Now how about some of the really little things, like the coolant reservoir cap. The plastic on all the tanks and caps like this will eventually do this, but it really makes me crazy. Basically, the cap expands and eventually flexes so much that it's impossible to actually tighten it down. Getting a new cap for these won't always fix it, but it's very cheap and worth a try. In this case, it still wasn't quite enough. This new cap is a bit better, and I feel like it's not going to fly off, but it still can't be completely tightened down without skipping a thread. We'll also take another look inside the air cleaner housing. It's fairly clean inside, and the filter's not in the worst shape. Still, we'll be replacing it with a new one. We'll go ahead and remove the whole air cleaner assembly so that we can clean it thoroughly. We'll start by removing the intake air hose. Then we've got this breather filter and little breather tube going down into the valve cover. All the rubber parts are extremely stiff, so it's not easy to get this tube out of there. But eventually we get it out of the air cleaner housing and out of the grommet in the valve cover. Then we can remove the steel retaining clip on the outside and separate the rubber hose from the breather filter. And we'll remove that grimy, probably original filter from the assembly. Then, to remove the rest of the air cleaner assembly, we'll slide the heat riser tube off of the exhaust manifold, remove a vacuum hose from the front of the throttle body, and then there's an electrical connector at the rear. I guess that's an intake air temperature sensor, but I'm not entirely sure. Either way, everything is disconnected and the air cleaner assembly is removed. Now that we have better access to everything, we can check the condition of all the parts, especially the rubber hoses. Since the old rubber grommets have lost all of their elasticity, we want to replace them with new ones. Unfortunately, since they're no longer pliable, there's no way to remove these in one piece. The best we can really do is try to break the grommet in one spot and try to remove it in as few pieces as possible. We also want to try to avoid dropping any pieces into the engine. It's pretty hard to get to this one between all the wires and hoses, but we managed to get it out without too much trouble. Then we'll try to clean up the edge of the valve cover and we'll spray some WD-40 on the new grommet to help get it installed. And once it's fully installed in the valve cover, we can reinstall the breather tube. Once again, some WD-40 on this connection will help make this process easier. And now that the passenger side's been taken care of, how about the PCV valve in the driver's side valve cover? This valve is easy enough to remove from the grommet and the hose by hand. Then, just like the other side, we'll try to split the grommet in one spot and then pull the whole thing out. Well, eventually. And again, we'll clean up the valve cover and use some WD-40 to install the new grommet. We'll also be installing a new PCV valve because they're quite cheap and we might as well. And we'll reconnect the hose going to the throttle body. This hose appears to be in good shape and is a tight fit on the PCV valve, so we'll keep using it. And another small thing that we're going to replace is the radiator cap. Of course, the radiator cap is very important to the cooling system and they're very cheap, so we might as well go ahead and put a new one on. And then we'll consult the box of hose. Should I call it that? Yeah, whatever. We'll consult the box and replace some of the crunchy old pieces, including the short pieces that connect the breather hose to the air intake. Some of the longer vacuum hoses are also in bad shape and actually have some holes in them already, so we'll definitely want to replace those. Some of the lines we'll be replacing include the ones hooked to this two-way check valve. Although that could have gone a little bit better because when removing this hose it maybe got a little bit rough and it snapped the back of that check valve off. Plastic does not respond well to age and engine bay heat, so I'm just going to go ahead and blame that, and we'll need to find a new one of those. In the meantime, we'll keep replacing worn hoses. Of course, we want to do this one at a time whenever possible to make sure everything goes back where it should. One of the hoses we replaced that was in poor condition was the one going down to the vacuum canister in the driver's side fender. It's not easy to show this because it's not easy to reach it, but we ended up getting everything replaced. And the same goes for the vacuum hoses to the evap canister. It took a while to find the part number for this thing and then find a store with one in stock, but here's a replacement for that two-way check valve that we broke earlier. It's always a good idea to test vacuum parts like this. Out of the box, this one wasn't sealing well, but a little bit of WD-40 helped everything seal perfectly. And it gives it that tangy water displacing zing we all know and love. So now we can go ahead and reinstall that along with the new hoses. Another thing that always bothers me is loose wires. So we'll just use some split loom to cover and protect as many wires in the engine bay as possible. And once the split loom is installed, we'll wrap it with some electrical tape or maybe just zip ties to keep everything together. We repeated this process and wrapped various wires and replaced various hoses around the engine bay. Since we have a bunch of new tune-up parts, we'll take a look at the old ones. We'll start by removing the two screws holding down the distributor cap and remove just enough of the spark plug wires so that we can take a look inside. It's definitely rusty in there, but the distributor cap and rotor both look like they're in good shape and were probably replaced somewhat recently. Even though we have new parts, for now we'll just go ahead and keep using the old ones. Part of it is because everything seems to work so well. I don't really want to go around changing everything all at once, because if a problem suddenly develops, it can make it harder to pinpoint the cause. One of the best things about this era of GM cars is just about all the parts are available very cheaply. One of the worst things is that most of the parts are made very cheaply, so it can sometimes be a little hard to trust new parts. The plan is to just leave these new parts in the car just in case they're needed on the side of the road, but most likely we'll just go ahead and drive it a little bit and then replace more things as we go along. And along that same line, we'll go ahead and pull out the number 1 spark plug and check it out. The number 1 plug is probably the easiest to get to, and luckily it came out without too much force. The outside is most definitely, crusty, but the inside looks very good. Judging by the rust, this seems like a pretty old spark plug, but it's in good shape and the gap is still within spec. The electrode isn't the cleanest in the world, but we'll go ahead and just wire brush it off and reinstall it with some anti-seize. Just like the other parts we mentioned, we have new spark plugs, but today is not really the day for that fight. Some of the plugs, especially the ones on that cramped passenger side, don't seem like too much fun to get to. Now that we've checked things out and taken care of some potential problem areas, we'll reinstall the cleaned air filter assembly. We'll make sure the gasket underneath it is in place and reconnect the vacuum hose and the electrical connector. Then we'll install our new breather filter into the side of the assembly. This one looks just a little bit cleaner than the old one. And once that's in place, we'll use a new steel clip to lock it in. And with a little bit of WD-40, we'll reconnect it to the breather tube with our new piece of hose. Then we can drop in the new air filter element and install the cleaned lid. Then we'll reconnect the intake air hose and the preheater hose that goes down to the exhaust manifold. Then we'll tighten down the wing nut to hold down the whole air cleaner assembly. It kind of feels like we didn't accomplish a whole lot here, but that's because we were just taking care of so many different small concerns. But in reality, these small tweaks and details make up the majority of the work on a car. Replacing wiper blades and PCV grommets may not be exciting, definitely isn't exciting, but it's all part of the experience of owning and taking care of a car. And since there aren't any big goals in mind for this car, that's kind of what I'd like this series to be about. I promise not all episodes will be this uneventful. In the next one we'll cover repairing the exhaust and working on the tail shaft of the transmission, but I think working on this car is going to be an experience worth remembering. And thanks to the magic of video, one that we can all share.